Hi, everyone. My name is Moliner-Roy, and I am a software engineer at Viv Labs, Samsung Electronics. I do research and development on Bixby, and today I'm super excited to be here to teach you how to intern teach Bixby. So here's a quick summary of the grounds we'll cover today. At first, I will give you an overview of Bixby, especially focusing on the developer side of things. Then I will show you how to get onboarded with the tools, and we will dive right in and build a sample capsule together from end to end. And finally, I will leave you with a little glimpse of what's coming next for Bixby. So first, I want to emphasize a few points about Bixby. Bixby, at its core, is a conversational personal assistant that learns about the user to help them get things done. And it is available across devices, across locales, and across modalities. So you can think of Bixby as living in the cloud, and there being different access points where users can come in and interact with it. So the most known access point, of course, are the client devices, for example, the Note 9, where users can come in and talk to Bixby. But there's also two new access points that we're happy to share with everyone today at SDC. And those are the Developer Center, which is a browser that you can, a website that you access through any browser, and the Bixby Developer Studio, an IDE, integrated development environment, that you download and run on your local computer. So Bixby is more than just a personal assistant. It's an ever-expanding platform. It's an ecosystem with tools and features for everyone to come in and collaborate. So what's a capsule? You've probably heard me throw that word around half a dozen times already. Simply put, a capsule is the term we use at Bixby to describe the full user experience. It's an ability in Bixby. It's a domain knowledge. So you can compare it to a space capsule in the sense that it launches the user to their destination of choice. But from a developer point of view, you can imagine taking a cross-section on that space capsule, revealing all the inner components that the user probably doesn't even know exist, but that are vital in getting them to their dream destination. So for a developer, a capsule is all the code that you write. It's all your designs. It's all the thought that you put into building this user experience. The Bixby Developer Center, as you've seen, is accessed through this URL here, bixbydevelopers.com. This is where you go in to sign up to the tools and download the IDE, the Bixby Developer Studio. There's also tons of resources there for you to learn about Bixby, everything from quick-started guides, tutorials, reference documentation for every single key. There's sample capsules you can download and run locally. And this is also where you come back at the end when you're done your capsule and you're ready to launch it. And from that point onward, this is where you will manage your capsule, the versioning of it, and also your team and your users and their permissions. The Bixby Developer Studio can be thought of in three different parts. So first we have the editor. It's really anything you'd expect from an IDE. It lets you navigate through your files locally and edit them using the keyboard. But there's also a few more unique attributes to it that are really specific to building in this AI world. For example, there's natural language training tools that we'll look into in more depth later that let you visually train Bixby and see its progress as it learns. And everything you're doing in the IDE is synced to the cloud, where Bixby will instantly return you some information to help you catch warnings or errors before you even try to run your capsule, for example, with static compilation checks. The simulator is the second window in the Bixby Developer Studio. On the left-hand side, the user, or you would pretend to be the user, essentially. And you would type in whatever you think the users would ask Bixby. And then on the right-hand side, you would see in the renderer how your dialogues and your layouts are looking so far. And then under the hood, there's tons of gears and toggles you can play with to configure this environment. So you can change, for example, the GPS of the current location. You can change your time. You can change your selection learning parameters and really try to mimic all the situations you imagine users would encounter in the wild. And finally, the debug console gives you an under-the-hood view of everything you've just run, for example, in the simulator. And it puts it in this visual representation, this plan graph here that we see, that lets you quickly assess what Bixby did. And this is a graph that Bixby came up on its own through dynamic program generation. But in showing it to you, you can confirm that, yes, this is what you wanted Bixby to do. And moreover, you can use this graph to navigate by clicking on the different nodes to immediately see on the right-hand side all the panes reshuffle and focus and filter to show you just the information relevant at that point in the execution of the user's query. So here's where the fun begins, and we get to build a capsule together. Of course, there's so many possibilities as to what we could build, but for me, there was no doubt that I would build a capsule related to space. As a matter of fact, the first capsule I ever built was a moon capsule that answers questions like, when is the next full moon? Or what will be the state of the moon on New Year's Eve next year? Things like that. I didn't give you a big intro about myself, but one thing is that I love climbing. I love getting as high as I possibly can. All my favorite sports, except for soccer, which gave me this astronaut boot, all involve climbing as high as I can. I do trail running, I do mountain biking. I just never get tired of that breathtaking feeling when I reach the top of a mountain and I see the whole world at my feet. So if I could, I would go higher. I would be an astronaut. But for lack of that being an option yet, I pretend and I read science fiction. I love science fiction set in space. One of my favorites being this trilogy, The Three-Body Problem. So I hope you can humor me today as we will work together to build a space-related capsule. And what we will do is we will pretend that we live in the future where space travel is now commonplace. It's normal for you to book a weekend at a romantic spa on Venus, or to go to Pluto for the winter holidays in a ski resort. So here are the use cases we're going to build around today. We're going to start simple, with a find space resort being our theme, and then we're going to enable the users to filter those search resorts and search by specific criteria, like searching by planet or by hotel amenity. So in the end, the user will be able to say something like, what's a low-gravity space resort on Saturn that's dog-friendly, for example? So this is the flow that we will be building. Once Bixby hears this sentence, it will go out, find the corresponding results, and then we will display them in a list with just an image and a summary for each hotel. And finally, when the user expresses their interest in one of these hotels, we will show the full details for that hotel in a details view. So without further ado, let me switch over to the IDE. Here. So this is the Bixby Developer Studio. Fresh slate. I haven't done anything but log in. So the first thing you would want to do when you get started is create a new capsule. Let's call it Space Resorts and hit create. So on the left-hand side in the navigation panel, we see a few empty folders were created along with this capsule.bxb file. This is just a simple settings file that Bixby needs to get started to know the ID of your capsule, the version, and the devices and locales that you're targeting. But you're probably noticing something unfamiliar. You're seeing this .bxb file extension. Let me zoom in. And wondering, what does that mean? What is this .bxb file? So this is a file extension containing this language called Bixby Modeling Language. And it's the language that we use to do development in Bixby. It's meant to be simple to read and author for both humans and machines. So it's what we will be using to communicate with Bixby, yes, in this simple settings file, but also later on with all our models, our layouts, everything will be built using this language. So it's important to understand it. The language consists of keys here in white and values in orange. And I'll switch back to tell you a little bit more about that. So the Bixby modeling language is a structured data format with a hierarchical schema of keys and values. But you don't have to worry about memorizing all the possible keys in this schema because it's broken down into different file types. And once you've picked which one you're interested in, for example, a model or a layout or a dialog, there's only really a handful of top-level keys to choose from, so root keys. And once you've picked one, you can easily use this autocomplete feature, control space, to see all the available keys at every level, view them, and insert them. So you'll see that files end up building themselves quite naturally. So more formally, the Bixby syntax can be summarized in two main rules. For one, it consists of keys and optional values. If you want to define a value for a key, you place the value to the right-hand side of the key using the round parentheses. And secondly, a key can have any number of children, and the parent-child relationship is described using the curly braces. So you would put curly braces to the right of your key. In the block you've created, you would insert the child keys, and in turn, these keys could have grandchildren keys, and so on and so forth. So to go back to this capsule configuration file, hopefully it makes a bit more sense now. Once again, the keys are in white, the values are in orange, and it's just setting properties for Bixby at this point. It's just a configuration file. And additionally, you can use the resources folder whenever you have something that you want, for example, translated for different languages or different on different devices. So you would put that information in the folder with the same, say, language in the resources folder, and then at runtime, Bixby would determine which language file to show depending on what the user is running. All right, so let's get to the actual meat of Bixby development, and that is the modeling. When we do modeling in Bixby, what we are doing is we are creating this conceptual representation of the world for Bixby. But we're not trying to recreate every single item that we see in the real world. What we're trying to do is give Bixby a mental model of the actionable world, of what it needs to get things done for the user. So what we're doing is we're defining this concept action network, which consists of concepts, so objects, entities that you can think of as nodes in a graph, and actions that are used to connect these nodes together. And what's going to happen at real time once we've defined our concept action network and we've defined natural language training is that Bixby will understand what the user said, identify in this graph the nodes that are present and the nodes that it wants to go to, and then on its own, it will dynamically generate a program to connect the dots using all the actions that we've defined. So this is what we call dynamic program generation. So like any programming language, the basic building blocks have different types, and we call them concepts, and primitives are the very base types. So we have, of course, booleans, we have numbers, and we have strings. Then we can put together these concepts, these primitives, into bigger objects called structures. And a structure has any number of properties within it, each with a type. That can be, in turn, another primitive or a structure. And that's how we build more and more complex objects in Bixby. All right, so let's go ahead and build our first concept. We're going to build the planet concept because we're going to use it both to display for the user to know which planet a resort is on, but also as a search input for users to filter for resorts around a specific planet. Excuse me. So we're making one assumption here, and that is that although we've explored the whole solar system, we've never actually reached Alpha Centauri, so we have a finite list of planets to work with. So when you have a finite, exhaustive list where you know all the values, you can use this type called an enum. So let's go ahead and define our first enum. So back in the IDE, I want to create a file. There's two ways to do that. I can right-click on the capsule, hit New, and then pick the file type I'm interested in. I can also pull open the command palette, Command-Shift-P, and search for whatever concept or what I'm trying to do. In this case, add a new file, and it will narrow down my options and even give me a shortcut. So in the future, I can remember Command-N will be the shortcut for new file. I'll create a file. It'll be a model, and it'll be an enum, and then I'll create a folder structure to keep my code organized, as well as a planet file. And hit create. So the folders were created here, and then we have a blank template with our enum, where all the values in the list of planets are defined using the key symbol. So here I would have Mercury. Oh, here's a good example. I can tell you about this autocomplete feature I was mentioning. At any point, if I hit Control Space, I'll see all the available keys at that level, and I can start typing to narrow it down, and when I'm happy with my choice, just hit Enter, and the symbol or the key will be inserted. So we have Venus, and so on and so forth. I don't think it's interesting for you guys to watch me type all the planets, so I'm going to just fast forward a little bit. And copy over more files here. So what I've done, and I'll walk you through the files I've added all my primitives in the primitive folder, and then I've put them together into a space resort structure where all the primitives are used as properties of that space resort. So of course, the space resort has a name, it has a description, it has a list of attributes. Attributes are like hotel amenities, things like low gravity. The planet that we just defined together, gravity being an example of a number type. So 1g is the gravity at Earth's surface. If we had 0.5g, we would feel half the gravity we're feeling now. And an image, which is another structure that I'm importing from a library capsule in order to get an image carousel in my layouts. So one thing to note here is that by default, the maximum cardinality for properties is 1. So there can only be one name to a space resort. But what I've done here is I've overridden the max for attributes to say it's okay if a hotel has a list of amenities if it has multiple amenities. So those are all the concepts we'll be needing for this capsule. The next thing we want to do is define our action. So I'll hit New File, pick the other type of model, the action, and create. So here we have an example of a static compilation check. If I hover over it, Bixby is telling me that I should define a type to my action. So I'll go ahead and do that. There's many types you can choose for. Most of them are related to transactions. Here we're just doing a simple search. And then in the collect block, I will define all the inputs that users can use to search for space resorts. So we said our use cases were searching by planet and by search criteria. And what I'll do is that once again, I will override the maximum cardinality to allow many search criteria to be searched for. And the output, of course, will be a space resort. This is saying that this action, when invoked, will return 0, 1, or more space resorts. And then I can reformat my Bixby file. and I've created my action. An action you can think of as a function signature. It's there for Bixby to use when it's planning and to understand how to put concepts together. But on its own, it doesn't provide the data to fill and instantiate a space resort at runtime. So what we need to do next is to connect this action model to an action implementation. And the way to do that is to use an endpoint file. So I'm going to go ahead, add my endpoint file, and hit create. We won't need any form of authorization, and we only need one endpoint here. So what I'm doing is I'm telling Bixby that when it needs to get data for this action, when it needs to run it, it should call this local endpoint findspaceresorts.js, which I've copied over into the code folder. It doesn't have to be a local endpoint. This could very well have been a remote endpoint, in which case I would have defined an HTTP link, a URL, and a method for Bixby to go ahead and, for example, make a REST API call to get the data. So Bixby is very flexible in where it gets the data, and the endpoints file is the glue to tell it where to go and get it. It's totally up to you how you want to implement your code or your service to find space resorts. If you host it remotely, you can use whatever programming language you would like. But one interesting fact to point out here is that the space resorts that I'm returning from my JavaScript are actually in a very familiar format. This here is JSON. So Bixby knows how to read in JSON and compile it into the .bxb format for the concepts that we've defined ourselves. So a JSON object maps to a Bixby structure, where all the properties and their names we define become the names of the JSON object. And Bixby is able to do all the type mapping. For example, all these loc functions are calling in translated strings. And the only other attribute to mention is that JSON array can be used when you had a property with maximum cardinality many. So that relationship is defined this way. So this means that even if you already had a service to find space resorts, you could connect Bixby to it, and it would be able to function using JSON format that you were possibly already returning. So now we have defined our concepts, our action model, our action implementation, and the endpoint to glue them together. So it's tempting to go ahead and test it and see if the data is flowing. So real quick, let's do that. I'm just going to paste in an intent here. You don't have to worry too much about this format, but essentially, I'm just identifying a few nodes in this graph that we've built for Bixby in this concept action network. I'm telling Bixby, assume you had a goal to get a space resort, and you had two values, one being a planet, Jupiter, and one being a search criteria, refueling services. What would you do? So, whoops, the other way. Let me try to maximize the simulator for you. So there we go. Bixby returned space resorts. They don't look like anything because we haven't defined layouts yet, but at least we're seeing the data is coming through. And if we click on any summary, by default, the design paradigm is clicking on summary goes to details. And Bixby is doing its best to show the data in a table so that we can quickly confirm that, yes, this is indeed on planet Jupiter, and it has a refueling station. But perhaps a better way to test this would be to go to the debug console here and confirm that the plan graph that Bixby dynamically generated indeed connected the two inputs through this find space resort action to produce space resorts as a goal. So note how I never told Bixby to use find space resort as an action. This is something it figured out on its own. It's kind of obvious here because there were no other actions that Bixby could have called, but as your capsule gets more and more complex, as you add, for example, transactions, or you're pulling geo points and time information and user contacts, the plan will grow and grow in complexity. And it's all something that Bixby does for you. You don't have to go in and think about all those use cases. Bixby will be able to put together the information to get the user to their goal, their desired goal. So now that we've confirmed that the data is flowing, the next step would be to make it pretty. So I'll just fast forward one more time. And what I've done here is I've added in my resources folder. The resources folder is the one I mentioned earlier that dynamically picks per device and locale. So I've put my layouts in the base so that they're shared through all my Bixby experiences. And I've defined a space resort here in the result view. So the way to build layouts in Bixby is also using the .bxb format. And the design team has provided us with a collection of layouts that we can use in order to build our layouts, so we don't have to worry about the individual styling on every single device. We have this contract that's guaranteed that if we pick these layouts, they will render no matter where. So it's quite simple to define your layouts. All you have to do is think about it as a template. Pick the template you're interested in from the collection, and then fill in the slots with your value. So here, for example, I'm saying when I have space resorts, if I have multiple of them, I will show them in a list of summary items. And if I have a single one, I will show it in a details format. So the summary, in turn, is defined in a separate file that pulls in an image card, sets its size, its image, and its title to be the space resort name. And right there, with 3 files, we've defined our layouts. The dialogues, I think, are super fun because they are built dynamically by Bixby at runtime. And as a developer, all I have to do is provide a few little fragments that are all separate. And then, depending on the context that Bixby is facing, it will be able to piece together all these fragments into a full readable sentence. So what I've done here is I've told Bixby, if ever you want to talk about space resorts and your context is you're showing a list of results, how about you say, check out this space resort concept. And in turn, I've defined this way to talk about this space resort in a separate file, or actually in 2 files with different levels of specificity. So when this space resort, if it happened to come out of a find space resort action, I'm telling Bixby, can you please append after the space resort the input planet that the user mentioned and refer to the search criteria to let them know that you understood these inputs. And then in turn, the base concept for a space resort is defined here, and it's just casing for singular and plural. For search criteria, I'm just going to echo with that option, just to hint that I understood the options. And for planet, I'm going to try to get a bit fancier, because it wouldn't make sense to say on planet for example, all the gas planets. So I want Bixby to be a bit smarter about the way it's talking about planets. So it would say on the moons of Jupiter when it's talking about Jupiter, or around Saturn, for example. So all these dialogue fragments are going to get pulled together to form a full sentence. So let's try it out. Can't go bigger. I'm just going to run the same intent I had. And this time, Bixby is saying, I found these space resorts on the moons of Jupiter with that option. And it's showing me the corresponding space resorts. And if I click on one, I get to the details view. with the image carousel I was mentioning. So it's looking good, and at this point, I would feel like trying everything and be like, Bixby, find space resorts, and start talking to it and tricking it and asking it all sorts of questions. But at this point, if I tell Bixby just find space resorts, it's going to tell me I didn't understand that. And the reason here is that although we've defined all these concepts, we've never tied them back to natural language. For all Bixby knows, we could have invented words. We could have said A, B, C, D, E, F, G are my planets. We could have defined our concepts in a different language. So it's really important as a final step to connect our concepts back onto natural language. And the way we do that is through training. So I'll go ahead and copy over some training. So let's go here, zoom back in. This is the Natural Language Training tab. It's made specifically to help you teach Bixby how to understand language, and the way that works is that Bixby learns by example. So you would talk to it and then tell it what that meant, and it would register that, and over time learn to extrapolate and generalize from all the examples you've given it. So let's add a new training. Let's say find space hotels with swimming pools around Neptune, god of the sea. And then space resort will be your goal when you see a sentence like this. And swimming pool is an example of a search criteria. Neptune is a planet. And I hit done, I can save, and I can inline verify that Bixby produced the plan I was expecting. It did connect the inputs through the action to produce space resorts. So I would go ahead and continue adding more and more training. I would use a variety of verbs to, instead of just saying find, I could say search for, research, show me. I wouldn't always say space resorts. I could say hotels, space hotels. I can use different types of activities that people want to do in their space resorts, and refer to the planets and use different syntaxes and so on and so forth. And once I've added a little bit of training, what I want to do is compile the NL model here. And what this means is that Bixby will take all the training I've created and learn on it and come back with the confidence whether yes or no it feels that it knows what we're talking about when we say that sentence. And you've seen that all of these have turned blue as Bixby learned them, except for this one, search for space hotels around the old Earth. So I would have two options when this happens. For one, I can keep iterating, keep adding more sentences, more variety to make Bixby more flexible. Or I can help Bixby and bootstrap the learning to make it faster and add a vocabulary file. So I've also copied in here this vocab file. For planet, it's quite simple because our concepts are the same, have the same name as the way humans refer to them. But since it's an enum, I should provide all the synonyms that I think users are going to mention those planets by. So for Earth, let's say in the future we talk about Earth, we say the good old Earth. So let's say the old Earth is a synonym for Earth. For Mars, the red planet, it's a common synonym, and so on and so forth. Then for search criteria, it's a little bit different because there's no way I can possibly imagine all the ways that users are going to refer to search criteria. I don't know what people are looking for when they want to go vacation in space. But what I can do is provide at least a starting point for Bixby. So I've provided a list of vocabulary. It's just a flat file. And what counts here is that I provide variety. So I have some of them are one word, some are two words, some are three words. This one's even 4 words. And this just shows Bixby like, it's possible that a search criteria might be this long, and Bixby will learn from that. So Bixby will take all the vocabulary for search criteria, for planet, along with all the training that we've created, and then it will go study it and learn to generalize from it and think about all the possible combinations of all these inputs and sentences. So if I hit compile now that I've added vocabulary, now everything is in the learned state. So we're looking good, and that means that we are ready to go ahead and test with natural language this time. There's another feature of the training tab that I'll just quickly mention. It's this search bar here. So this can help you identify if you're just repeating the same word over and over again. You can also search more specifically for like everything with a certain goal or with a certain value. So it's a pretty advanced search. Here I just want to show you that, whoops, I've used the word show quite a few times. The word look I haven't mentioned once in all the training I've put in this capsule. But just for the fun of it, let's test Bixby and say look for space hotels. So Bixby was able to understand what I was talking about. So I'm going to say, look for space hotels with rover rentals. And indeed, all these resorts that Bixby found have rover rentals as amenities. I can search by planet. I can say, look for space hotels around the red planet, for which we just added the vocabulary. And it will give me 2 resorts on Mars. For example, the Martian Oasis, this culinary institute that serves the best potatoes in the whole solar system. And then I can get crazy and go look for space hotels with quantum bungee jumping around Saturn. And here I go. I hit play, and Bixby found 3 hotels, and I can confirm in the debug console that it pulled out quantum bungee jumping as a search criteria along with Saturn, piped them through the action, and produced space resorts. So that's it. That completes our end-to-end capsule. We've covered all the important parts in order to build a functional capsule in just one session. But there's a lot more that can be done with this capsule, and my colleagues will be extending on it in the next presentations today and tomorrow. For example, there will be a session on how to really improve on the natural language training. There will be a session about best practices, about selection learning, about hints, and all these extra user delight features that can be added. And my colleague Siamak tomorrow at 12:30 is going to build a full transactional flow on top of this capsule so that you can actually go in and not just find the space resort, but also book a room in a habitat pod for the Christmas holidays, for example. So let's go back. And just to recap, the key components in building a capsule were the models, those being concepts and actions, the UI, so the layouts and the dialogues, and the natural language, so the vocabulary and the training. And there's a lot more coming soon, as you overheard in the keynote. So there's more features, there's more devices, there's more modalities, so ways to interact, like hands-free, eyes-free, things like that. And of course, the marketplace where you will be able to launch your capsule. So I hope this was enough to get you started and that you can go out and start building your capsule and be ready when the time comes and have a head start in order to launch it. So these are the other sessions if you want to go learn more. And also, our team will be hanging out at the Bixby booth and the Bixby Code Lab. And we encourage you to come visit, come ask me more questions if you had any, and even try out to build a capsule on your own. We have walkthroughs, and we want you to try it, have fun with it. There's even some little incentives. There's some raffle tickets you can win and win some cool prizes from that. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Thank you.